Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for today's Lunch and Learn. With me today is Chris Kemmerer with the Bureau of State Parks, and we are going to have a lovely discussion about winter activities, ways you can stay engaged, ideas for activities for you and the whole family just to get out there and enjoy winter. So thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Wonderful. So I'm going to just sort of kick it off to you. I understand you have a little presentation for us.
Yep.
And I just want to remind folks viewing, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to leave them in the comments and we'll get to them after Chris's shindig. So wonderful.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to switch things over and get my presentation started and we'll get going. Alrighty. So here we go. So it's thinking about things. So hopefully everybody can see my opening screen. So as Sarah mentioned, we're going to be talking about winter today, specifically activities that you can do during this pretty awesome season, in my opinion. As Sarah said, my name is Chris Kemmerer. I work for Pennsylvania State Parks as our Education and Interpretation Section Chief. So I have a really great position in that I get to promote and support all of the programming that we do across the Bureau. We have about 100 amazing educators out in the field at parks doing amazing programs, talking about our forests or waterways, teaching you how to go kayaking or camping, or even a little bit about the history and some of the cultural resources that we have in state parks. So I'm really excited to be here today, and let's get right into it. So what is the next half an hour or so going to look like? So we'll talk about outdoor recreation, right? Those traditional things that you typically think of with winter, what you can do outside. Then we'll look at the season more as kind of like the science, like what is the science of winter and the science of snow, and what are some ways that you can explore nature during winter. We'll talk about community science projects and a little bit about what community science is. Then we'll talk about some safety and some things to consider when you're spending time outside. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So outdoor recreation, we're going to start with what would be considered traditional outdoor recreation, such as cross-country skiing and snowshoeing. So one of the things that we hear very often in Pennsylvania State Parks is that folks think that we're closed in the wintertime. That is not the case. We are open year-round for you to come out and explore. There are certainly some facilities that may be closed in the wintertime, like obviously our swimming pools are closed in the winter, and we may limit access. So for example, at Hickory Run State Park, you can't drive back to Boulder Field. We tend to close that road and not maintain it during the winter, but that doesn't mean that intrepid souls couldn't go and snowshoe back to see Boulder Field. So one of the really great things about cross-country skiing and snowshoeing is that they have a really low entry point into the recreation, meaning that the equipment is not very expensive, and you don't necessarily need anything special, if you will, to kind of get involved. So many of our parks will actually groom trails for cross-country skiing, but most of our trails are available for cross-country skiing as long as there's enough snow. Same with snowshoeing. If there's a trail that you can hike in the summertime, chances are that same trail you can go snowshoeing on in the wintertime. The only real kind of thing to consider is that you want about like 6 or 8 inches of snow to really kind of make it worthwhile. Because particularly when you look at snowshoes, they're kind of there, they give you a greater surface area, so they kind of make you float above the snow, and you kind of get that effect and you get that benefit a lot more when you have about 5 to 8 inches of snow or more. The other really great thing about snowshoes is that you can get a pair, from Dick's, from L.L.Bean, from REI, probably from most places, probably from Amazon, a decent pair, probably for as little as $70 or $80. So that's a really low entry point into a really traditional outdoor recreation that you can do anywhere. I mean, you can literally do it down the sidewalk in your neighborhood if you wanted to after a fresh snow. But oftentimes we don't necessarily get a lot of snow in Pennsylvania anymore, or at the very least, not in my neck of the woods down here in South Central Pennsylvania. So there are lots of recreations that you would think of as traditionally something that you may do in the summer or in the spring, but you can easily do those same recreations in the wintertime. And I would wager that there are some benefits to doing those things in the wintertime as well. So some of those things that are kind of quite obvious, I would think, would be to go hiking or to go birding. One of the benefits of going hiking in the wintertime, obviously, other than just being able to get outside and enjoy the outdoors, is that with the leaves off, you may be able to notice things that you didn't notice during the summer when the leaves were on. A really good example of that is like hiking throughout Pennsylvania, whether it's in state parks or state forests or in your local community parks. You may find that there may be remnants of old buildings, foundations, and things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see when all the leaves are on. So it's a completely different world to explore, and you notice different things that you don't normally notice when the leaves are on the trees. I also think birding is a really fun activity. I'm a birder myself, so I think it's a great activity to do any time of year. But I particularly like doing it in the wintertime. We get a lot of waterfowl that overwinter here in Pennsylvania. They tend to be brightly colored. And what's really great is that they tend to be relatively stationary on our lakes and on our streams and rivers. So it makes identification much easier and much more rewarding, particularly if birding is a new activity for you. But then two other activities that I really like to do in the wintertime is geocaching and orienteering. So geocaching, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a high-tech treasure hunt. So you can download a geocaching app onto your phone. You can also pay $10 for a slightly enhanced version of it as well. You can also go to the website to learn more about it and to download the GPS units. But essentially what it is that there are millions of caches across the world. And what they are they're a container. So in the image in the upper left-hand right, it is the medicine bottle looking container with the green sticker. That's the cache, and pretty much somebody hides them somewhere. They record the GPS coordinates for that, and they kind of put it out there with some clues or a hint. We all know that GPS units aren't super accurate, at least down to a foot or less. So you get to about an area, and then you kind of have to start to search. You need to start to use those hints and those clues to find that cache. Oftentimes they're hidden in some way. And then there are things that you can trade, like those little trinkets, or there's like a logbook, so you can kind of note that you were there. In the time of COVID, you might want to be mindful that you're handling things that other people are handling, but it's a really great activity to do year-round. And depending on if there's snow cover or not snow cover, it may make it more challenging or less challenging, as the case may be. Another activity that I really like is orienteering. I'm a little bit of a map geek, so that's probably one of the reasons why I like orienteering. So the idea behind orienteering is that there are these waymarks that are kind of out in the woods. They are typically a square. On the diagonal, one triangle is white, the other triangle is orange. We have permanent courses, I believe, at 9 or 10 of our state parks. Kings Gap outside of Carlisle is one that immediately comes to mind. But there are also clubs like Delaware Valley Orienteering Association. There's also one for the Susquehanna Valley, and they set up temporary courses, and they also have permanent courses as well. So what it is that you get a topo map, a topographic map. So it shows you the elevation, but it's even more detailed than that. It'll let you know if it's a rocky area. It'll let you know if an area is really shrubby, or if it's more open forest, or if it's meadow. And then with your map and compass, you kind of work your way around this kind of this course, and you look for these markers along the way. I like doing it particularly in the wintertime and learning it in the wintertime because, again, the leaves are off. So it's a lot easier to go and see some of those waymarks. And for those of you that have students at home, it's a really great way to teach them compass skills. It's a really great way to teach them map reading skills. And of course, you're getting out there and you're enjoying nature. So It's a really great activity to do. You can get a really good compass for as inexpensive as $10. So again, it's a really easy entry point into the recreation. And for those parks that do have permanent courses, you can get a copy of the courses map at the park office. So those are just some outdoor recreations, some traditional and non-traditional that I encourage you to try at some point over the next couple of months over winter. So shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit more about the science of winter and exploring nature a little bit more. And it's really hard to talk about winter without talking about snow. So I have like a random list here on the screen for you. I'm going to talk through each one, but just know that we'll be putting links up to many of these activities in the comments so that you can go and get the PDF and get the full instructions on how to do things. So I'm just go in order, even though there's no order to it. The first activity is a really simple snow melt activity. And pretty much what it is, it's with a clear plastic cup or container, go outside, scoop up some snow, and then take a guess. Make a mark with a marker or a dry erase marker on that plastic cup, on that container, for where you think the water level is going to be once all that snow melts. The reason why snow is is fluffy and why it's soft is because there's a lot of air in there. It's also one of the reasons why it, oddly enough, makes it a really good insulator. So when we have a really wet snow, there's less air in there, so we're probably gonna have a lot more water. A drier snow, it's gonna be a lot fluffier, there's a lot more air in there, so we'll probably have a lot less water out of that. So it's a fun little experiment, particularly if you do it throughout the winter and you have different types of snow, and you can kind of start to compare the volume and the differences between different kinds of snow that you have. The other interesting thing about snow melt is when you do that, you'll probably find some kind of particles, dirt on the bottom. And that's because in order for snow to form, it needs what scientists call an ice-forming nuclei. Really, it's just a piece of dirt, pollen, a grain of salt, a grain of sand, that ice crystals start to form on. And from there, we can get a snowflake. But when the snow melts, you can see that. So with a really simple hand lens, you can go and filter the snow melt through a coffee filter and kind of take a look at what some of those particles were that helped form the snow. Observing snowflakes is a pretty classic activity. Take black construction paper or any dark colored construction paper or fabric, throw it in the freezer, and then when it is snowing, so when it's actively snowing outside, take it outside and you'll be able to catch snowflakes on that surface. Because of the black, you'll be able, or the dark color, you'll be able to see the snowflakes really well. In a drier, fluffier snow, you'll probably be able to see the snowflakes with your naked eye. Again, with a really inexpensive hand lens, you'll probably be able to pick up even more detail. So that's a really simple, easy, kind of fun activity to kind of sense of the different kinds of snow or snowflakes that we're having. Snow pit activity. This is one where it would be beneficial if you have deeper snow, or if you're in an area of the state that was able to kind of maintain snow cover over maybe like 2 or 3 separate snow events. Essentially what you do is you kind of dig a pit within an open area where there's snow, so in your backyard or perhaps in a field, and you dig it down to the ground so that you see the various layers. So you'll be able to see the various layers of snow. At the same time, though, you'll notice that there are differences in those layers. Perhaps there is like a melt period, or even if there wasn't a melt period in between, but just through the compaction of additional layers of snow, it changes the layers on the bottom. And you can investigate the hardness of those layers. You can investigate the temperature and do some investigations about the insulation properties of snow. There's a full lesson plan on that from NASA, which we're going to link. And what's really interesting about snow pit is that it is something that we perhaps not do regularly here in Pennsylvania, but in areas of the world where avalanche is an issue, such as the Rockies or in the Alps, they do these regularly to go and help gauge and measure the likelihood of avalanche occurring. Because as you get more snow, and as the snow gets compacted and you go through freeze-thaw cycles, oddly enough, your bottom layers of snow lose a certain level of surface tension, and you get the top layers that kind of want to slough off, and that's what kind of causes that avalanche effect. So that's a fun activity to get into, particularly if you have more snow cover throughout the winter. Another fun thing to kind of experiment with is the albedo effect. We've probably all noticed it, but we probably never knew there's a name for it. So probably the best example of this is in the summertime. If we're walking with bare feet and we walk on asphalt or black pavement or dark pavement, it's really hot. It probably burns our feet. But if we then step onto, say, the grass or even onto a concrete sidewalk, that temperature is much less. It's not as hot. And what albedo effect is, it is the ability for a surface to reflect light and radiate heat back. So surfaces that are light colored or white, like glaciers and snow, have a really high albedo, so they can reflect a lot of heat and sunlight back into the atmosphere, back out into space, where your darker surfaces absorb that kind of heat. So the albedo effect is kind of going and running an experiment and kind of showing how those two differences, how that occurs on different surfaces. So that's kind of something fun, and that's something that we definitely will go and recognize and see throughout the winter. You know, if you ever walk out on a really sunny day and there's snow on the ground and it's like blinding, it's that albedo effect of the snow because it has such a high amount that can be reflected. I mentioned about snow formation earlier. Dr. Bynak's Peekaboo Kids and Met Office How Does Snow Form are two really great videos that you can Google and search for on YouTube, and they talk about how snow is formed. Dr. Bynak's is definitely for kids. Oddly enough, it's longer, probably about 10 minutes. The Met Office one is very good and accurate, but that one's much shorter, about 3 minutes. So if you're kind of interested in how snow is formed and the process, definitely check out at least one of those two videos. Another great activity to do, simply because it's kind of easier to do during the winter after a fresh snow than any other time of year, is to do a tracks and traces activity. And basically, we have a really simple guide at DCNR and that we developed with state parks that highlight some of the most common tracks of the animals that you're going to find here in Pennsylvania, from, you know, chipmunks and squirrels and rabbits up to bear and deer and elk. And you can download that guide. It's a PDF. And under fresh snow, you can easily go out for a really quick walk, whether it's in your neighborhood or out into a forested or field area, and make observations about what animals live in your area just by observing those tracks and traces. The other really interesting thing about them is that different animals have different cadences in terms of their walk and different patterns of their walk. So a river otter, a weasel, a mink, they're going to have a different pattern of movement than, say, a bobcat or a fox. Likewise, they're going to have a different set of pattern or movement than a rabbit. And you can really see that change in pattern pretty easily when you have fresh snow. So definitely check out that Tracks and Traces PDF to help you discover what lives in your neighborhood. You may be surprised what is moving that you may not have even realized in your neighborhood by doing that. The history of snow is probably, for older kids, a little bit more of an online kind of research project, but the idea behind that is to simply go and use weather.com or AccuWeather and research either what the snow cover was for a given winter, or to investigate what the heaviest single snow event was for that winter, and then to graph that and to make inferences about why there were perhaps some changes over time. And then for the language of snow, again, it's a little bit more of an online research, or perhaps going to the library to do some research. But particularly peoples that are native to the Arctic regions have numerous words for snow. And it's more so because they categorize, and each type of snow has its own word. So it's a really simple, kind of interesting way to learn about different cultures and to learn and understand how our natural resources and how nature really kind of influences culture and influences tradition. Of course, we live in Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, so not talking about trees, as I don't think I'm allowed to. I had to talk about trees. So a couple kind of interesting things to do with trees is to simply go and do some winter tree ID. One of the easiest tools that we have to identify trees, their leaves, we don't have right in the wintertime. So it makes it a little bit more of a challenge. And it forces you to make observations about other characteristics that perhaps you otherwise wouldn't look at. The winter tree finder that I have the photo of, it's a really inexpensive field guide. It's probably $5 or $6. You can pretty much get it anywhere. And it can kind of help you walk through the identification of some of the more common, easier trees to identify in the wintertime. So two examples of that would be our beech trees as well as our sycamores, because their barks are so very obvious. For a beech tree, if you ever see a tree that has a really kind of smooth gray bark, some people say it kind of looks like an elephant's leg or an elephant's foot. But at the same time too, with beech trees, their leaves tend to persist, meaning they still have their brown leaves still kind of holding on throughout the winter. So if you ever see that tree in the woods where it has a really kind of smooth gray bark and it has brown leaves still like hanging on, that's a beech tree. So that's the fun thing about the winter tree ID, is that you can get to learn some of the trees and different characteristics of some of our trees that you may not otherwise think about in the summertime. To elevate that a little bit more, to perhaps make it a little bit more challenging for yourself, or if you have middle school or high school students, is to identify the twigs. So without having the leaves on the trees, oftentimes it's really difficult to identify a tree down to species. But if you start looking at the characteristics, so the leaf scars, the bud scars, if it has lenticels, you can identify it down to species. And the reason why I say that this is a little bit perhaps something for yourself or for a high school student is because to really get down to it and to do the ID properly is you do need a twig, like newer growth of the tree, and a tool in order to be able to cut it like a scalpel so that you can see the pith or the middle part of the tree, because the way that pith is organized and laid out is one of the things that really helps you identify what species it is. And we have a link to a dichotomous key that can kind of help you get to at least some of the larger families. And of course, if we're talking about winter, we have to talk about pine trees and conifers. So obviously you want to, the easiest way to do winter tree ID is to figure out who your pine trees are and who your evergreen trees are. But the other thing that I really like and that I think is really kind of interesting is to look at the patterns and to look at particularly pine cones and to bring them into a math lesson. So some of you may have heard of Fibonacci, the Fibonacci number, Fibonacci sequence, and it is a series of numbers that starts with 0 and then it goes to 1, and 1 plus 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, and it kind of goes on like that. And it sets up for ratios that you see repeated a lot in nature. So specifically for winter, you'll see that pattern in pine cones. So you can see the picture on the screen of the pine cone that kind of has the green swirls on it. So that's the bottom. So in the middle is where that pine cone was attached to the tree. And from there, you can kind of trace out, you can use paint, you can use markers, and you can trace out that spiral. And you can go and start to count the number of scales in that spiral and even how many spirals there are there, and you'll find that those numbers will match up with Fibonacci numbers, which is, and I believe I have an activity that we can link for that as well. So you can even bring math into things, which is pretty exciting. And then of course, there's lots of great books about winter. These are more picture books, storybooks. So this is probably, second, third grade on the upper end, and definitely to your younger ages for sure. And you can really kind of tie some of these together with some of the other activities that you might want to do. So if you download, say, the Tracks and Traces guide that we have, and you want to go out and you want to explore, you might want to go and perhaps start with In the Snow, Who's Been Here?, which is a great little story about a brother and sister that go out exploring in and around their yard after a fresh snow, and they see all these tracks, and they see all this evidence of animal life and animal activity. So this is a great way to kind of link some of the other activities that I had mentioned earlier on. And this was only kind of tip of iceberg kind of stuff. So some of the resources that we tend to use a lot to kind of help build our winter programming, we use Discover Nature in Winter by Elizabeth Laylor quite a bit. Hands on Nature is a really great book as well. It has tons of activities, not just for winter, but all year round. Particularly if you have like third graders or younger and you kind of want to get them out, kind of exploring, asking questions and beginning to wonder. And then of course, we really use NOAA and NASA a lot for a lot of their resources, particularly if you have older students. They have lots of good graphs and maps, and links out to actually some of their scientists that are doing field work. So there's lots of great resources there. So just kind of want you to know that, you know, really tip of the iceberg. And in terms of these two books in particular, you could probably go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Acorn Naturalists, and you can purchase them from there. Kind of shifting gears a little bit into community science. This is going to get you outside for sure, but kind of gets you doing science, but also kind of feeling good about what you're doing, because the data that you collect is going to be used by scientists. So if you're not familiar with community science, it's also known as citizen science. So these are established and verified scientific projects that are set up. They have protocols, so they have a certain way you need to do things. But you and I, as just ordinary people, can participate in these projects, collect data, and share that, and essentially give that data to scientists that they can then verify and use in the research that they're doing. So there are so many projects, but I'm just going to highlight a few. So winter is a really good time for a lot of bird-related projects. So two of the main ones are Project Feeder Watch, not Project Feeder Water, Project Feeder Watch, and then Great Backyard Bird Count. So Project Feeder Watch is a project of Cornell University. This, I believe it does cost $15 to participate in, but all the other ones are free. And essentially what you do, kind of your area, so whether it's your whole backyard or just a small 10 by 10 foot area, but you put out a bird feeder or multiple bird feeders, and the idea is that you make an observation twice a week for at least 15 minutes, what species and how many of each species is coming to your bird feeder, and then you report that back to Project Feeder Watch. And it is a way for them over years, over decades of seeing that data. They can look at population densities, they can look at migration, they can use that with other data to project range expansion or contraction for birds. So it's really interesting what they're able to do with the data. The Great Backyard Bird Count is a project of the National Audubon Society. It is just over 4 days, typically over President's Day weekend, and very similar to Project Feeder Watch. They want you to go out and observe birds and let them know what species and how many you saw. The difference here is that it doesn't need to be tied to your backyard feeder or any other feeder. It can be anywhere. So maybe you just go for a daily walk in your neighborhood. You can jot down what species you see on that walk and report that back to them. Or perhaps you're going to go out to a local park and you're going to go for a walk and you'll observe the birds that you see. You can report that back to them through that. And then there are some that are very much focused on winter. One of those is Ice Watch USA. And pretty much what you do is you sign up to observe a lake or a creek or a stream, and you simply observe it for the formation or lack of formation of ice, and you report back what you see, what you notice. And it's just a way of kind of tracking ice, but they can go and then use that other information compiled with historical data to see, is the season of ice over? Is it shortening? Is it lengthening? If we have the same length of season, but maybe we're not getting the same depth. So there's lots of information that scientists can use to get from that. Another one is winter salt watch through the Isaac Walton League. As you know, particularly here in Pennsylvania, we put a lot of salt on our roads to help maintain them and make sure they're safe for travelers. But that salt getting into our streams affects the pH, ultimately affects the health and the water quality of those streams. So this is simply a way to monitor streams and to keep an eye on the health of our streams and our waterways. And then kind of going back to what I talked about with outdoor recreation, there are some things that we think of as very traditional winter activities, but at the same time, there are things that you can do year round, and you shouldn't be limited just because it's a little snowy or a little cold outside. So two of those projects that you can do year round are iNaturalist and the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. The Community Collaborative Network is pretty much you have a rain gauge outside, which can be as simple as a coffee can with a ruler in an area kind of free of obstruction. So not underneath a tree, it's not underneath a pergola, pretty much in an area where it's going to get the precipitation into it pretty evenly. And you'll record the precipitation. So whether it rains, snows, hails, you record how much precipitation you got during that particular weather event, and you record that back to them. It helps them track areas of drought, of not drought. It also helps them kind of take a better look overall. They add it to other data sets to take a broader look at climate and what's changing or not changing in regards to climate. iNaturalist is pretty much it's social, which is really kind of cool. So basically what it is, you can download the app onto your phone, or you can just kind of use it through the website. And they want you to make observations about plants and animals that you see when you're out and about, whether it's in your yard, whether it's on your walk, in your neighborhood, it doesn't matter. Take a picture of it, ping the GPS location. They give you some suggestions of what the ID of that particular species is, and you kind of put it out there. And then what's really cool is that it can help you with ID, where other users of iNaturalist can then go and verify that your ID was correct, or give you suggestions of what they think that ID is of that particular plant or animal. And then the more times it's verified, the better and stronger that data is. And then scientists can use that data in many different ways. So those were just some community science projects. But there are many. Some of them require, say, perhaps a weekly commitment. Others are as easy as taking an occasional selfie. So if you're interested in other projects, maybe you have different interests. Maybe you're interested in amphibians, or you're interested in wildflowers. Chances are there is a community science project for you. So check out scistarter.org to find a whole slew of community science projects that you can get involved with. And with that, we'll kind of start to wrap things up with some things that you should consider when you are going outside. Obviously, we all know that the cold can be a danger. So there are some precautions that we need to take. And the best one is to layer up, and to layer up properly. So a really simple way to think about this is you want a base layer that's going to whip the sweat away from you. So think like wool or silk long underwear. Then you want a mid layer that's going to insulate you and keep you warm. That's your fleece. Those are your down jackets. And then you want an outer layer that's going to prevent wind blocking and is going to be waterproof. So that's probably your Gore-Tex jacket. And then of course you don't want to forget, hat, hands, and boots. The great thing about layering up as well is that, particularly if you're out for a long period of time, particularly if you've never gone snowshoeing and you try snowing this winter, which I really hope you do, you'll find that the amount of layers you need when you start is probably going to be a little different than the amount of layers you need in the middle of the activity. So by layering it up is going to enable you to kind of to be able to better regulate your heat, so you don't over sweat and get too hot, and then with that end up cooling down too fast. So layering up is a good thing because you want to move your sweat and moisture away from you, but at the same time, it gives you the tools to make sure that you have that you're properly protected. The other thing to kind of think about is make sure you drink plenty of water. It's always good to stay hydrated. And in the winter, it's a little bit drier than other times of year, so it's better. It's even more important to stay hydrated. We probably don't think about this, but you can still get a sunburn in the winter, particularly if it's snowy out and the sun's out and it's reflecting. So make sure you wear sunscreen and sunglasses. It's really important that you know where you're going. Have a map. Even if it's a place that you go to pretty frequently, if you've never really been there under snow cover, everything could look different. You may not be able to see the trail quite as well. Other features that you typically look for may be covered up because of the snow. So just kind of make sure you know where you're going and have a map. And then finally, recognize signs of exposure. Recognize if you're getting too cold, and then if you need to come inside. So one of the things that kind of happens initially, and we've probably all experienced this, is frost snip. It is a thing. We probably have experienced it when your cheeks get really red and rosy and kind of get kind of tingly. It happens a lot on our fingertips as well, particularly for not wearing gloves. And essentially, like the top 1 or 2 layers of our skin is essentially starting to freeze, starting to get cold. And that's why they get kind of tingly and when they hurt a little bit. And frost snip is pretty easy to reverse. You put gloves on if you don't have gloves on, or you kind of pull up your scarf a little bit more to get it out of the wind, get your cheeks out of the wind, or you simply come inside. But if we're not mindful of that and we continue to allow our skin to be exposed, particularly once we get to below freezing, particularly when wind chills kind of kick up, the likelihood of that happening increases. Of course, around here we have relatively mild winters, but still it's just something to kind of be aware of to make sure that you have a really safe and fun time when you're outside. So I threw a lot at you, a whole bunch of information, hopefully some ideas that you really kind of like globbed onto and you want to try. But with that, we are going to open things up for questions. With that, I think I'm going to minimize my presentation, and so you can just see me.
Hey, Chris, that was so great. Looks like we don't have any questions currently, but all of the information that you mentioned today is going to live there in the comments, so folks can access that. That was a really great presentation. I loved how you involved, if you want to get outside in the cold, you can, but there's also a lot of ways you can stay engaged with the outdoors from the comfort of your own home, from your window.
It's kind of like a choose your own adventure kind of thing, right? And everything can, be done in, any size group that you're comfortable with. So, so I hope, if there are no questions, I kind of hope that I inspired someone somewhere to try something and to not be quite so intimidated by winter and not to think of it as, automatically to think that you need to hibernate inside. Although we do enjoy that, I hope that you all get out and explore a little bit, because guaranteed, if you spend a little bit of time, you will discover something new outside in the wintertime. All right, thank you.
Thank
Happy
you so
Thanksgiving,
much, Chris.
everybody.